The billionaire yanked his maid by the hair, dragging her across the grand ballroom. The moment her feet left the polished marble floor, a scream echoed, sharp and desperate, and that scream became the catalyst for everything to unravel. "You worthless black slave!" Richard's voice pierced through the soft hum of the party, shattering the music in the background. His grip tightened in Evelyn's hair, pulling her backward, forcing her to stumble. A tray of glasses crashed to the floor, sending a cascade of shattering glass across the ballroom. The room went silent for a second, as if time itself had paused. Gasps filled the air, and guests in tuxedos and gowns froze mid-step. Their eyes widened in shock as the world's most powerful billionaire dragged a woman, his maid, across the floor by her hair. Above, the chandeliers sparkled, casting long shadows on the cold floor below, highlighting the brutal spectacle unfolding. "Richard, stop! Please!" Victoria, his wife, cried out, gripping his arm in an attempt to stop the madness. But Richard was beyond reason. His fury had consumed him. Pathetic, always in the way. He spat at Evelyn, his words venomous, his eyes blazing with rage. Richard's face turned crimson as he glared down at her. "Do you think you can humiliate me in front of my guests?" he growled, tightening his grip even further, yanking her hair so roughly that Evelyn's knees buckled. Her black shoes scraped across the floor, the pain in her scalp unbearable, but her eyes, dark, wide, and defiant, never left his face. "Please, sir," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling, but there was no sign of begging. Richard sneered at her. "You don't tell me what to do. You work for me. You are nothing without this house." The crowd murmured. Some whispered in disbelief, others too stunned to speak. "Is he insane?" Someone hissed from the sidelines. "This is all over the internet now," another whispered, clutching her pearls as she filmed the scene on her phone. Richard's teenage son Daniel pushed through the crowd, his voice cracking as he tried to intervene. "Dad, stop! Let her go! Everyone's watching!" he pleaded. But Richard was too consumed with pride, his anger fanning the flames. He dragged Evelyn further into the center of the room, as if punishing her were a performance for the audience.
"Look at her," Richard barked at the crowd. "This is what happens when servants forget their place." The words hit harder than the physical assault. Evelyn's lips trembled and her body ached. But deep inside, something inside her snapped. For years, she had been a silent witness to Richard's cruelty, enduring his insults and commands with no response. But tonight, under the lights and the cameras, she felt a shift, a deep resolve that no longer bent to his will. Her chest rose and fell, her breath becoming louder than the silence of the orchestra that had long stopped playing. Richard leaned closer, his breath hot with fury. "You will never speak again in my presence, do you understand?" It was in that moment that Evelyn knew. It was time. She had carried a secret, a truth that had stayed locked in her for so long, a truth that could destroy him and free her at the same time. The guests leaned in, their hearts racing, their phones trembling in their hands. Everyone was waiting for the explosion. No one blinked. And in that silence, Evelyn's lips parted. The word that would bring everything crashing down was on the tip of her tongue, and Richard had no idea. His empire, everything he had built, was about to collapse with just one word. Richard's grip tightened as he yanked Evelyn forward, dragging her by the hair with a force that was both humiliating and brutal. The ballroom was filled with gasps, but no one dared to intervene. The guest list was a mix of CEOs, politicians, and socialites, all of them now staring at the display of cruelty unfolding in front of them. But Richard didn't care about their stares. He cared about control. His empire was built on dominance, and tonight he would remind everyone why he was the one in charge. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, but she kept her eyes locked on Richard's face. The pain in her scalp was unbearable, but there was something more that gnawed at her, something deeper than the physical torment. This wasn't just about humiliation. It was about a man who thought he could destroy her, erase her existence with a single act of violence. She had been invisible to him for years, a shadow in his mansion, doing his bidding, swallowing every insult and command and never once speaking up. But tonight, as Richard dragged her across the floor, something inside her changed. The years of silent suffering came rushing to the surface, and her resolve hardened. She was no longer his invisible servant. She was a woman who had a voice that would not be silenced by this man. "Let her go!" Victoria shouted again, her voice trembling. But Richard was beyond reason. His face was red with anger, his eyes wild as if the world was closing in on him. He had never been challenged like this before. His wealth, his power, his charm, none of it had ever failed him. But here, in this moment, as he dragged Evelyn through the ballroom, he was losing control, and he couldn't stand it. "Stop this madness, Richard!" Victoria's voice cracked, but Richard just ignored her. His grip was like iron, pulling Evelyn deeper into the center of the room where the guests had stopped moving altogether. The orchestra had stopped playing, the music silenced by the chaos unfolding before them. Phones were now pointed directly at Richard and Evelyn, capturing every moment of his disgrace. Richard could feel the eyes of everyone on him. The humiliation was unbearable, but it wasn't about the guests anymore. It wasn't about Victoria. It was about power, about reminding everyone who was in charge. "Look at her," Richard shouted, his voice echoing through the marble hall. "This is what happens when servants forget their place." The words stung, sharper than any slap. Evelyn's knees wobbled, her body aching from the pull of her hair, but her eyes never left his. Her gaze was cold, unwavering. She had heard this before, the words of a man who saw her as nothing more than a tool. But now, those words no longer held power over her. She was done being the silent, invisible maid. Tonight, she would show Richard just how wrong he was. The crowd murmured, their eyes glued to the scene unfolding before them. They had seen Richard Whitman as a philanthropist, a man of power and wealth, someone who built his empire with hard work and charity. But now, they were seeing him for who he really was, an angry, arrogant man who believed his wealth could shield him from the consequences of his actions. The guests whispered among themselves, the tension thick in the air.
"Is he crazy?" someone asked, their voice hushed but urgent. "This'll ruin him," another murmured, the words barely audible but filled with fear. The whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire, each person knowing that what was happening here, tonight, was more than just a display of violence. It was a breaking point. The moment when Richard Whitman's carefully crafted facade would crumble. Evelyn's eyes burned with a fire that was more than just rage. It was defiance. She had lived her life in the shadows, serving the Whitman family, taking their abuse, their insults, their commands without a word. But tonight, with the cameras on her, with every person in the room watching, she finally saw an opening. The truth she had buried deep inside her for so long was now within her reach, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. Richard's breath was coming fast, his chest heaving with fury. He was a man used to getting what he wanted, to bending people to his will. But Evelyn wasn't like the others. She wasn't afraid of him. She was done being his pawn. "Don't speak to me like that," Richard spat, his face twisted with anger. "You're nothing without me. You're nothing without this house." The crowd shifted. Some guests looked ready to intervene, others paralyzed by the raw intensity of the scene unfolding before them. Daniel, Richard's teenage son, pushed his way through the crowd, his face pale, his voice cracking as he begged his father to stop. "Dad, please," Daniel pleaded. "Everyone's watching. This isn't you." But Richard was too far gone. His pride had taken over. He yanked Evelyn harder, dragging her to the center of the room where the light from the chandeliers cast long shadows over them. "Look at her," Richard barked, his voice booming. "This is what happens when servants forget their place." Evelyn's body trembled, but her gaze never wavered from his. This was it. This was the moment she had waited for, the moment when she would finally break her silence and take back control. The room was silent now. The only sounds were the whispers of the crowd, the sharp clicks of camera phones capturing every moment. And Evelyn, standing there in front of Richard, trembling but unbroken, knew that this was the moment that would change everything. She could feel the weight of the room's attention on her, the eyes of the guests piercing through her. But it didn't matter. She wasn't going to let Richard get away with this any longer. "Do you hear that, Richard?" Evelyn's voice was soft but firm, cutting through the chaos. Richard, caught off guard, stopped in his tracks, his grip loosening slightly as he stared at her. His face was flushed with rage, but Evelyn didn't flinch. "You thought you could control me," she continued, her voice steady, each word stronger than the last. "You thought that I would always be the invisible maid, doing your bidding without ever speaking up, but you're wrong." Richard's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Evelyn thought he might lash out again, but she stood her ground. She had endured too much to back down now. "You are nothing but a coward," Evelyn spat, her chest rising and falling with each breath. "You hide behind your money, your power, your reputation, but you can't hide from the truth." The words hung in the air, thick with tension. Richard's face twisted with anger, his eyes darkening as he tried to regain control. He was losing it. Losing control of the situation, losing control of the people around him, losing control of everything he had worked so hard to build. "Shut up!" Richard yelled, his voice cracking with rage. But Evelyn didn't flinch. She had seen this side of him before, angry, out of control, desperate. "Do you think you can humiliate me?" Richard bellowed. "Do you think you can break me in front of my guests?" Evelyn looked around the room, seeing the stunned faces of the guests, their phones raised high, their cameras capturing every moment. They were all watching now. They weren't just witnessing violence, they were witnessing the unraveling of Richard Whitman's empire. "I don't care what you think, Richard," Evelyn said, her voice rising now, louder than before. "I don't care about your empire, I care about the truth." Richard recoiled as though she had slapped him. His grip loosened completely now, and Evelyn took a step back, her heart pounding. She could feel the weight of what she was about to do. The secret she had kept for so long, the truth that had been buried beneath layers of power and deceit, was about to come to light. "I know what you did," Evelyn said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I know what you've been hiding. You can't silence me anymore. I'm done being afraid of you." Richard's face went pale, his eyes darting around the room, as if looking for an escape. But there was no escaping this. The truth had been revealed, and there was no way to undo it. You're lying," Richard stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know what you're talking about." But Evelyn could see the fear in his eyes. He was afraid, and for the first time in years, she felt a sense of power over him. "You covered it up, didn't you? You killed that boy and buried it with your money. You thought you could get away with it, but you're wrong." The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. His body stiffened, his breath coming in short gasps. The room was still, the air thick with tension. Evelyn stood there, her hands trembling, but her eyes blazing with defiance. "You killed him," she repeated, louder this time. "And I have the proof." The room exploded in whispers. The guests were no longer just spectators, they were witnesses. The truth was out, and there was no turning back now. Richard staggered back, his knees shaking, his body trembling with disbelief. He had spent his entire life building this empire, creating a facade of power and wealth. But now, in front of everyone, that empire was crumbling. Evelyn's words rang in his ears, echoing through the room like a death sentence. "No," Richard croaked, his voice barely audible. "She's lying. She's making this up." But no one believed him. The guests, once captivated by his charm and power, now looked at him with disdain, with pity.
His wealth, his name, his reputation, all of it meant nothing now. Evelyn had shattered the illusion.
The door to the ballroom swung open, and two uniformed officers walked in, their presence commanding immediate attention. Richard's eyes darted toward them, his face going pale as he realized what was happening. The room was still, the air thick with tension. "Mr. Whitman," one of the officers said coldly, his voice firm but calm, "you're under arrest for assault, and we have enough evidence to charge you with murder." Richard's body went limp. His face drained of color, and his legs gave out beneath him. He collapsed into a chair, his hands trembling as he tried to grasp the edge of the table for support. But it was no use. The truth had caught up with him. The officer turned to Evelyn, his eyes softening with respect. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked. Evelyn nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I'm fine." Richard was dragged toward the door, his hands cuffed behind his back, his face pale and filled with fear. The guests stood in stunned silence, their phones still raised, capturing every moment of his fall from grace. And outside the mansion, the world was already watching. The billionaire who had once ruled with an iron fist was now being dragged away in handcuffs, his empire destroyed by a single word. The atmosphere in the ballroom was electric with tension, every eye fixed on Evelyn as she stepped forward, holding the documents that would bring Richard to his knees. The charred edges of the car registration, the settlement papers, the proof he had tried so desperately to destroy, they were now in her hands. With a steady, unwavering voice, she held them up, revealing the truth for all to see. "These," she began, her voice slicing through the air, "are the papers he thought he could erase. He tried to burn them, but I saw them. I saw the truth he's been hiding for years." Gasps erupted around the room. Phones were now zooming in on the documents, their lenses flashing with every click. The truth had been laid bare. Richard, desperate to maintain his power, lunged forward, his hands reaching out to snatch the papers away. But two guests instinctively stepped in his path, blocking his way. His face turned crimson, sweat dripping from his temples as he struggled to keep his composure. His voice cracked with fury. "You all know me," Richard shouted, his body trembling with rage. "You know what I've built, what I've done for this city. I'm not a killer." But the crowd no longer saw the billionaire philanthropist. They saw a man unraveling before them, a man who had spent decades creating an image of perfection, only to have that image shattered in front of his very eyes. A man exposed by a maid who had nothing but the truth on her side. Daniel, Richard's teenage son, pushed his way through the crowd, his voice small and shaky as he tried to stop the madness. "Dad, stop! Please, just stop!" he begged, his words barely audible over the murmurs in the room. The ballroom, once filled with the sounds of laughter and music, now felt like a courtroom. Evelyn, who had once been silent and invisible, was now the witness everyone believed. She had the truth on her side, and Richard, for the first time in his life, was powerless. Outside the mansion walls, the world was already watching. Phones were raised high, capturing every moment of Richard's downfall. The whispers grew louder, the cameras flashed brighter. The moment had arrived. Evelyn stood tall, trembling but unbroken, the documents still clenched in her hands. Richard, the man who had once held the world in his palm, now stood before her like a cornered animal. His face was pale, his eyes wild with fear and confusion. The truth had finally caught up with him. Then the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps echoed across the marble floors, a sound of authority that silenced the room. Two uniformed officers stepped forward, followed by a detective in a dark suit.
The air shifted instantly as their presence filled the space. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, the officers moving toward Richard with unwavering confidence. His voice trembled with both anger and fear. "What is this? Who called them?" Richard demanded. "This is my house, my event." But the detective ignored him, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Evelyn. The bruises on her arm, the disheveled state of her appearance, the documents in her hand, everything about her screamed of the violence she had endured.
"Ma'am," the detective said, his tone firm but gentle. "Are you the one who contacted us earlier?" Evelyn swallowed hard and nodded, her voice breaking as she spoke. "Yes," she said softly. "I told you what I found. He attacked me tonight and years ago." Her voice faltered for a moment, but she pushed forward, pointing directly at Richard. "He killed that boy, and he covered it up." The room fell into complete silence. Every ear in the ballroom was straining to hear the officer's next words. Richard, unable to contain his anger, exploded. "Lies! All of it! She's framing me! She's nobody!" he shouted, his hands flailing in desperation. But the detective remained calm. He turned back to Evelyn, his expression grim. "Mr. Whitman, you are under arrest for assault, and, given what we're holding here, you're also being detained in questioning in connection with a hit-and-run homicide." The crowd erupted. Some gasped in disbelief, others whispered among themselves, and a few even clapped softly. Richard's face went white as the weight of the situation sank in. He tried to push past the officers, his voice rising in panic. "You can't do this. Do you know who I am?" But the officers moved swiftly, grabbing his arms and forcing him into handcuffs. Richard struggled, his cufflinks scraping against the marble floors, but there was no escaping his fate. The cameras flashed like lightning, capturing every moment of his fall from grace. Victoria, Richard's wife, collapsed into a chair, her face streaked with tears. Her perfect emerald gown now looked like a symbol of a life that had just shattered. Daniel stood a few steps away, his face pale and hollow, unable to watch his father's humiliation. He didn't follow Richard as he was dragged away. He simply stood there, staring at the ground, as if realizing in that moment that the man he had admired was nothing but a facade of lies.
Evelyn stood frozen, her hair disheveled, her cheek red from where Richard had dragged her, but her eyes were steady. She watched as Richard was loaded into the back of a police car, his head buried in his hands, his empire now reduced to rubble. The world had seen the truth, and nothing could undo what had been done. The crowd around Evelyn whispered in disbelief. Some looked at her with sympathy, others with awe. A black maid, a woman once invisible in the eyes of the powerful, had brought down one of the most influential men in the country. An officer approached her gently, his voice soft but respectful. "Miss Carter, we'll need a full statement tonight, but for now, you did the right thing." Evelyn nodded, her voice a whisper but filled with resolve. The truth always wins, no matter how long it hides. As the police car pulled away, its red and blue lights flashing against the stone walls of the mansion, Evelyn felt the weight of years of silence lifting from her chest. She had spoken a word no one else dared say, and with it she had ended an empire built on blood and lies. Richard Whitman, the billionaire who thought he was untouchable, had been destroyed by one word. If this story moved you, if you believe truth and justice should never be silenced, do me a favor, hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it, because sometimes sharing the truth is the most powerful act of all.